I'm Nicole Dutton, editor of the Kenyon Review. I'm delighted to welcome you to the fourth and final week of In a Few Words, a series of conversations between faculty and fellows of the Kenyon Review Writers' Workshop. Although we cannot gather in person this year, we hope this series of conversations offers a brief glimpse into what makes the Kenyon Review Writers' Workshop such an exceptional, unique, and vibrant space. This week you'll be listening to Geeta Kothari and Nicola Dixon, Kate Hedeen and Kelsi Vanada, Nick White and Kelly Flynn, and Kaveh, Akbar, and Chase Berggrun as they read from and discuss each other's work. The Kenyon Review is dedicated to nurturing, publishing, and celebrating the best in contemporary literature. We aim to expand our community of readers and writers across the globe. This is work we cannot do without you. If you were able to make a donation, please consider a gift of $5, $10, $15, $25 or more dollars. You can use the donation button at the bottom of your screen. And now, please enjoy In a Few Words.
Hi, everyone. I'm Geeta Kothari. I was supposed to be teaching a nonfiction workshop at the Kenyon Review Writers Workshop this summer. Obviously, that's not happening. And I'm here with my trusty and lovely fellow, Nicola Dixon, who I have known for many years. We are both former students of Nancy Zaffris, and we're excited to be here. We're going to give you a short taste of our work. I'm going to be reading a piece from Nicola's essay, Just Like Johnny Cash, and then we'll talk a little bit about it, and then she will read a piece from one of my essays, and we'll talk a little bit about that. I hope you'll find it instructive, or at the very least entertaining. So I love this essay so much, and I'm going to start actually with the first 3 paragraphs, and I'm going to cut part of the second paragraph because there's a swear word in it, and I don't know if we're allowed to read those out loud. Oh, there is, no. Nicola. Hold a book long enough and it will remember you, I promise. The wetness of your breath and the oils from your fingers will commingle over time with the ferric oxide in the pulp to produce rusty little marks on the page. The process is known quite beautifully as foxing, and although it rarely alters the integrity of the paper, you mustn't paw your way through life assuming touches are innocuous. It was early morning in northern England. Knobs of lard crackled in pans, blistering sausages. Dogs trotted out to relieve themselves. Newspapers with Thatcher's face were tossed from BMXs. I loved watching the dads get into their cars, so brisk in their strides, jingling their keys. Weren't dads great? These were the men women wanted, broad-shouldered, bringers of bacon, assertive with a stick shift, and quick with a wink, singing Daydream Believer as they released the clutch to leave. Impeccable specimens steeped in the respect of their peers and Drakkar Noir pour un. I'd found a book when we moved in, The Home Doctor by John D. Comrie, MD, 1931, a fat hardback A to Z medical reference of pre-war maladies and their household cures. We'd never had a book before, but immediately found a use for it because somebody was too busy watching the bloody football on the telly to watch the bloody saw, and now the bloody sawed-off bunk beds had bloody wonky legs, and we're not made of money, Steve. My sister's half was all right. Mine wasn't. Mom sucked on a Benson and Hedges and said, "Bring me the Home Doctor," with the feigned exasperation of a woman who fixes everything. She slid it underneath the leg. Problem solved. I was ever so grateful. I had a terrible condition I hadn't yet mentioned, but now had everything I needed to fix it. A room of my own, and unlimited access to John D. Comrie, MD, a man whose purview included tobacco was good, opium was better, and eugenics was a noble area of study. And so begins Nicola's essay. I was really interested when I first read this, just at how you set up the essay, how you establish this very detached tone, And you use, it's an essay about fertility and motherhood, but you're coming at it very indirectly in this way. And even, I mean, I think even in the first paragraph, the I only appears once. So it's really interesting to me, this tone and this kind of detachment you've established, and also the balance that runs through the whole essay. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Thank you. As you mentioned, we met in fiction class or two, thanks to Nancy. And one of the techniques we studied was the use of transitional objects. And this was my first really focused, committed creative nonfiction piece. And so I was treading into uncharted waters a little bit, and instantly turned to the fiction tools I had, the fiction writing tools I had. So I have always found a transitional object to be extremely helpful in getting myself into and out of worlds. And as long as I can do that in a structured way, then I can achieve balance throughout the piece.
And how important would you say this book was in getting both the tone, because the paragraph that follows that talks about the female body, but in relationship to this book, right? So it's sort of like you're talking about yourself, but not in a sentimental or even necessarily a very personal way.
Yeah, well, I wanted it to have a very be emblematic in more than one way, so I didn't want this, the book has reappeared again. I wanted it to, also speak to our class. The most important thing to me personally was it really was the only book we had, right from Chilton's Guide to the Ford Escort 1982, and it was used more often than not, not as a book. So it was also one of the few things that survived the move and is still on my bedside table today. So it was helpful, actually, to be very tactile with a transitional object. And
right.
All that stuff didn't come from memory. It came from me actually touching it again as a 45-year-old. So it was really helpful to have a tactile transitional object during the writing process, and kind of reassuring too.
Right, it gets the reader into the piece too, because we're drawn in through the object and the description of it, and we're not sure where we're going yet, but the authority in the voice establishes itself very quickly, and so we're in good hands right from the beginning.
Yeah, I think it's nice to have something fresher than memory, when you're delving into this stuff. So
yes,
there was the newness to that was really helpful that I didn't anticipate. The one unique thing is I've used transitional objects in the past, but I've never kicked off a piece with one, and I think I'll do that again.
Good.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the introduction and talking about my piece, Geeta. I am extremely happy to be your fellow and wish we could be there in person. I think you're quite expert at writing about family and themes that are often explored in creative nonfiction, that you do it in a way that isn't indulgent at all and very, very revelatory at the same time. I enjoyed reading your piece, Dreams of Home, and I think I'd like to just read this passage real quick. My mother never used the phrase, "last night I dreamed." She acted like someone who never had dreams, like someone whose body could forget an entire decade. She spoke about Lahore in terms of achievement, learning English, winning awards, prizes, and a scholarship to university. One of her childhood friends, who also lost everything, told me how my mother completed her knitting homework for her. She pulled my ears for knitting the collar so badly. It looked like dog's ears, the friend said. My mother, sitting across from her, smiled, and later, when I asked for more, claimed to have no memory of the incident. I know we were just talking about transitional objects, and one of the things that I love in this piece is you actually do apply that box and it speaks so much throughout. But what I want to ask you is, how do you allow yourself to speak for others in a piece, especially when, you know, you might have been given the old chestnut, like, you never write about me. How do you emotionally give yourself the green light to do that? What do you do?
I think it's really hard. And I think in the case of my mother, it helps that she's been dead for, you know, now 15 years.
Yeah.
But it's also, you know, you use the word, and it's not indulgent. And I actually would say the same thing about your work too. And these are subject matters where it's really easy to indulge in sentimentality and in nostalgia. And I really feel that is, if I'm going to speak for my mother, I also have to honor some part of her sense of privacy.
Absolutely.
And right, so I can talk about what I've observed in her and qualify it by saying, you know, I didn't know, or I had to guess, or this is what she told me. Her particular details, you know, Lahore was where she spent 10 formative years, and then during the partition lost everything. And it just gets excised from her personal history to some degree. She can talk about it really sort of generally. And I don't think that was unusual for that generation. You know, I call them the silent generation or generation silence, because they couldn't talk about that trauma, which was so closely linked to the independence of India. And I think knowing that larger context and how it formed my mother also really helps, because I'm always thinking about the history behind everything I'm saying about her, and that she was someone very much informed by her history, if that makes sense. So it gives me a chance to go back and forth. And if anything, I have to watch out for what one of my readers calls the journalistic voice, because that's what you're trying to do is cut to the emotion and your emotional connection with this person without being indulgent, but also without being a journalist, which is right. What I'm not. You know, I'm not reporting here. I'm not just delving in fact, and there is some speculation. But you and I have also talked about this, how hard it is to write about other people, even if you do have their permission. So you're always sort of, I think, walking that line, and also understanding that most people are not going to be happy with the way they're represented on the page, no matter how well you do it. So you just, you know, you just got to do it and hope that you're not upsetting anyone,
right.
But also staying true to your story. So I think that's, you know, that's always the nonfiction writer's dilemma, right? Is how to stay true to the story, how to represent the people correctly, but also to bear in mind you're walking into other people's lives and using them for your own purpose. Right. Right.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kate Hedeen, and I am an instructor for the Literary Translation Workshop for the summer workshops at the Kenyon Review. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to start out by reading a poem by my Peter Taylor fellow, Kelsi Vanada, who I actually met because she wrote a review of one of my translations. And we've also seen each other very many times at American Literary Translators Association meetings. The poem that I chose today to read by Kelsi is a translation of hers of a Spanish poet named Sergio Espinosa. The book is called Into Muteness, and I'm just going to show you because I really love the cover. And it recently came out with Valise Books. It was actually launched at AWP. The poem that I'm going to read is Untitled, and it is part of the second part of the book. I'm going to read it first, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about why I chose it. Sometimes, just sometimes, I think about distance, I question whether things should be measured in meters or intentions. How much belongs to me if I pray? How much if I perish? How much if you come? If I come through this garden of ours, I spin if I'm in. Charge here, tell me, what is this night and whose is this mouth I feel between my fingers? If mine is the truth, tell me who, and tell me what do I have to know? To bristle again in the fog, tell me at which moment. Does the embrace fall? Does the sun fall? Do I fall? Tell me, stranger, and tell me where the border separates us. If I'm in charge here, tell me how much longer till we leave this place, or at least tell me how many more times I'll feel loved, protector, your firm lash. So I really love this poem for a number of reasons. And the poems that, I'll just say in a general sense that the poems that are my favorites are ones that hit me right in the gut and leave me breathless. And this poem does that in many ways for me. First of all, just in terms of content, the word distance, of course, really resonates with me right now at a moment where we're talking about distance in so many different ways. And so the impact of that was immediate in terms of content, but also in terms of form. In general, I am drawn to form that tends to be experimental, and I'll just show you the way that this looks on the page. So the poem here looks like a prose poem, however, it is a lyric poem. There's no punctuation. There's really, really interesting, provocative enjambment happening, and I really like that too. Of course, what is particularly of interest to me is the fact that this is such a fantastic translation. And it is a fantastic translation for me in a number of ways. So in general, this is a poem in English, and that is really, really important. One of the things that we talk so much about in the workshop is the idea of transcreation, of creating something new from a source text, and the act of translation being just as legitimate creative act as any other of the creative writing workshops that happen at Kenyon. So what do I like specifically about the poem in terms of the translation and the transcreation behind it? I love the rhythm of the piece, and I think that's really, really developed with the internal rhyme that's going on there, and also the use of alliteration. I really think that what Kelsi does in terms of respecting the experimental nature of the poem is alive and well in the English. And then for me, what was really impactful about it was the word choice. I'm just going to give two quick examples that are key to me in this poem. First of all is the choice to use the word meter. So the source text uses the word metro, which as a unit of measurement, translation into meter. However, the fact that Kelsi decided to use the term meter rather than using something that's more familiar to us in the US at least, like yard or feet, really indicates to me that her approach to translation is one in which she is open and embraces otherness, and she's respectful of the source text. That's really, really important. The other word that I think is just perfect here, and it's a genius move, is the last word of the poem, and that word is lash. Now, the term in Spanish is látigo. Látigo can mean, if you were to look it up in a dictionary, it would most likely tell you whip. So the fact that she's used lash, for some of us are like, well, I wonder why she might have done that. For me, it's a perfect fit because, first of all, the term látigo in Spanish, in English, lash replicates those same sounds. And at the same time, it's a peculiar word. It's a provocative word. It's a word that we might not necessarily go to. And to end the poem with that kind of a word is really, really smart. And it shows me that, again, the way that Kelsi approached this poem was to create a poem in English, not just replicate what the poem does in English. She created it. So those are the reasons that I chose this poem.
Thank you, Kate. It's a really rare and special experience to hear someone else read your translated poem and then talk about it so closely. So as Kate mentioned, I first encountered her work through a book that I reviewed, a translation. I'll show the cover as well because it is also fantastic. This book is called Tasks. It's by Cuban poet Victor Rodriguez Núñez, published by Cohen Press. So I wanted to read a poem from Tasks because it's sort of where Kate and I first met. And I love this poem because it is really focused on language and writing and takes that kind of as its subject. So I'll read the poem and then speak to it a little bit more. This is Contemplations. To winter like the willow, with deep, patient roots, to warm my hands with memory, island embers, and to be like the squirrel birchwood heart bleed, there's nothing recorded. Crepuscular ink, permanent emotion, doesn't spill here. Everything's become too pure. Mother's scolding, frozen mist. I can only count what you don't feel. But I know it's in you. There are too many things to name, and words play dumb, don't pay attention. Deny you speech. There are breakdowns in night's factory, emissions of torment. Dream dismembered, cascade of sewer water, an innocent void, turns out nouns like soot. Space flooded with the Argentine pen. You're not at all concrete, just willpower. The adjective schemes against the world. Everything will be unreadable. The boldness of being here, while roosters crow to arouse the light. In this odd-numbered book, there won't even be an adverb for the cardinal to make its nest. Wind reads a brave oak's branches, and mist parodies silence. Poets, flies embellish the world. Feed off everything, whatever being's left over. There will be a footnote in this book of elements. Snow will correct the sentimentalism of leaves. The north will polish signs hung from branches. No corner will be left unsettled by the spider of meaning. Writing goes over God's tasks. So I love this poem because I think it really helps show what Kate talks about in her translator's note in this book, which is that Tasks was not only kind of a turning point for the poet in his poetics and in his form, but also for you, Kate, a kind of turning point in how you thought about translation and your own voice. So you end your translator's note with this sentence, which has really stayed with me. Here I have finally found my own poetic voice in the voice of the poetry I translate. And that just really helped inform some of my early thinking about my own philosophy of my craft as a translator. And you can see it all through this poem. I think it's partly in the form. The poet calls this an edgeless poetry, where sort of thoughts and ideas and emotions are all flowing together. And I think that just made a space for you to sort of play your voice through the translation and use it as a helpful poetic constraint.
Thank you, Kelsi. That was, this is a fantastic exercise to be able to hear our work in the voice of others. I mean, and actually very appropriate to what we do as translators. So thank you so much. It means a lot to hear what you have to say about my work. And thank you all for listening.
Hi, my name is Nick White, and I am an instructor at the Kenyon Review Writers Workshop. And this is Kelly Flynn. She is my Peter Taylor's Fellow. I first met Kelly last year when she was in my workshop, and one of the writing prompts that I give my students is I ask them to retell a fairy tale. And Kelly did this prompt, and what I'm about to read is what she wrote for that workshop, and I was very blown away by it. The title is Woke Prince. Next month marks the 100th anniversary of Princess Aurora's falling asleep, and no one in the kingdom knows what to do. As the only eligible prince, I feel an immense amount of pressure. Okay, I do have an uncle who is twice divorced, so he's technically available, but he's nearly 50, and that's just creepy. For years, no one talked about consent or about the princess's status as a minor when she first fell asleep. But lately, there are a number of newspaper op-eds and journal articles about ethics and pundits paraded on the television circuit. I know the princess may not wish to be kissed by me, or by any boy at all for that matter. And what is with the fixation on her being beautiful? I mean, yes, she is beautiful, but who cares? She presumably has a brain too. I wonder if the buzz about the upcoming anniversary really stems from concerns about her agency. The kingdom's economy depends on the endurance of the story of Sleeping Beauty. Visitors can go to Aurora's World, a theme park with a giant replica of the royal castle at its center. When it first opened, an actress laid in a bed inside the castle, dressed as the princess. Guests could kiss her for a small fee. A media backlash ensued. Now guests can only take pictures with the actress, hovering over her feigned lifeless body. For those wanting the real deal, tours of the castle grounds take place throughout the year, with tourism peaking during the summer months. Although no one can officially enter the actual castle, people find their way inside. Signs of depression, saying you want to join Briar Rose. Now a temporary grave, those in pain and desperate for relief come to the castle with the hope of one day resurrecting again. Each year, new bodies litter the floor, like the dead left behind on Mount Everest. Spindles do not really exist anymore. Now textiles are formed by mechanical means. Do these machines have sharp parts that could prick the finger of a princess? Does any sharp part count? And Maleficent, she died years ago, a heart attack, the silent killer of women. For all we know, the curse died with her. As a child, I went to Aurora's World once, with royal photographers in tow. I was encouraged to kiss the woman playing the part of the princess. I refused, crying until I was ushered out of the amusement park. The picture, however, shared with the media was taken when I first arrived, as I posed outside the castle with the 3 fairy godmothers, one arm held out, the other holding a funnel cake. I know this is not about me, but no one asks me if this heteronormative fairy tale with a girl I have never spoken to works for me. I worry about so many things, but most of all, that one day I will scream in public, please excuse me from this narrative. And so I really love that piece a lot. I think I like the humor, I like the pathos, I like the pacing, and I really like the voice of it too. You do all these sort of like great things that I think retellings should aim to do, which is to look at a very sort of mythological story, a story that has great resonance today, which I think Sleeping Beauty still does, and sort of pokes holes in it and tries to re-examines what it means in this current moment. So yeah, I love that a lot.
Thanks. I love hearing you read it because I never would have written if it hadn't been for you. We got that prompt and I remember Googling like princesses. I was trying to think about who I wanted to write about and saw that Aurora is considered the one with the least agency of all the Disney princesses. So never would have happened if it wasn't for you. So thank you. Thanks for reading it.
Yeah.
So I am going to read from Sweet and Low, and I'm going to read from the end of The Exaggerations. I've never read the end of a short story in a reading before, but I love this entire story and I love the ending. It feels like it's going in an unusual direction and then it kind of veers back to where you think it should end. I've been trying to tell the story of my uncle for some time now. He comes and goes in my thoughts, perhaps more than anyone, even my mother. I always finally come back to that night at the hospital morgue, his body recently delivered from Canada. Aunt Mavis had asked me to go with her. Please, she had said, so I went. A fat nurse led us to the cold room where they kept the bodies before the funeral home fetched them. My aunt clung to my arm as the nurse unceremoniously slid the body out from the metal lockers on one of those shiny slabs. Suddenly there he was, Uncle Lucas. Can we have a minute? Aunt Mavis said to the nurse. She nodded and told us she would come back in 10 minutes or so after rounds. When she was gone, we inched closer to the body. It's just us now, she said. We are the last. Then we heard a cough and jumped. Standing behind us was Buddy Cooper, a little fatter than when I had saw him, but still wearing his tall cowboy hat. I called him, Aunt Mavis explained to me. Buddy Cooper couldn't meet my eyes as he stepped toward the table. His boots made loud click-clacks against the linoleum floor. He looked down at my uncle's body for the longest time. You better go on and touch him now, my aunt said, because he won't feel like himself when the funeral home gets through with him. So Buddy Cooper placed his hand on Uncle Lucas's smooth forehead. Like this, we quietly waited for the nurse to come back to us. Uncle Lucas's funeral caused enough of a stir in our lives to bring home my mother from Nashville. According to her, things were good in Music City. She had landed a gig as the backup dancer for Tanya Tucker and was slated to go on tour with her next month. Soon, she told me, we were going to be golden. Seeing her for the first time in nearly 8 years, I didn't know quite what to make of her. This woman, my mother, all that makeup made her look much older than I remembered, and her hair was dyed a frightening white blonde, had been teased into great whirls above her head. What are you? I wanted to say to her. What have you become? The only thing solid she knew about me was that I made good grades, that I hadn't made a B since the 5th grade. My aunt had dutifully mailed her copies of my report cards every 9 weeks. So when people came up to us at the visitation service, she led off with this information. My son here, she'd chime, the scholar. I really didn't know what to say to her. She asked me about college and I told her which ones I'd applied to. She asked about majors and I listed off several that I thought would impress her. It soon became apparent to both of us that we spoke different languages, and trying to translate proved too painful. For the graveside service, my mother had asked the Methodist preacher to say a few vague words about goodness and mercy, just in case, she said to Aunt Mavis. Besides the preacher and the workers at the funeral home, it was just the three of us huddled around, the open mouth in the ground. I was standing between my aunt and my mother, each of them an arm laced in mine. When the preacher finished, the workers slowly lowered the casket. Then something unexpected happened. My mother broke from us and began to sing, impromptu. Love lifted me. Her voice fell off key at times, but she was still beautiful and pure. My aunt and I looked up, following the delicate sounds as they floated up and over our heads. When I tell the story of my uncle, I want to end it there. My mother singing. It seems right to me, but I can't. Truth is, Buddy Cooper never showed up that night at the morgue, and my mother never sang in the cemetery. In fact, she never even made it to the cemetery. She went back to Nashville the night of the visitation. It was just Aunt Mavis and I, at the hospital, at the grave. In the real story, there was no repentant lover for dead Uncle Lucas, and no song for me. Only the hard silences left by the people we wanted, the people we craved the most, who had already moved on in their lives without us.
Thank you so much, Kelly. I really appreciate that. I really appreciate you having us, you being my student last year and agreeing to be my fellow next year. Thank you to Kenyon Review for doing this.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kaveh Akbar, and this is my good friend, Chase Berggrun. We are friends and poets in that order. I am in sunny, beautiful Indiana right now. Chase, where are you?
I am in my parents' basement in Cape Cod, Massachusetts.
Cape Cod, Massachusetts?
Yeah.
We are both people who sort of hop around a lot, but Chase is based in New York. I am actually based here in Indiana. And we're just here today to talk about poems. We're going to just, the Kenyon Review invited us to pick a poem from each other's that we really love. And, you know, I love pretty much Chase's entire oeuvre. I never know how to say that word, so I say it like sort of like cartoonishly, self-exaggeratedly.
I think that's the way to go with French when you don't know how.
But yeah, I've loved Chase's poetry as long as I've loved Chase, and so picking a poem to talk about was difficult, but I did pick one. It's a newer one of hers. This one from I think the November 2019 issue of Poetry. Is that right? December 2019 issue of Poetry. It's called Nostalgia. So I'm just going to read this poem, and then I'll say a little thing about it, and then Chase and I might talk about it for a second, and then I'll cede the floor to my better. So this is Nostalgia by Chase Berggrun. Whist is wetness, and why, wind, why? Go and gather quickly before every shadow has dispersed to everywhere but beside you. God governs only what happens while it happens. This want is wine of your own making. Loud the quieter times, and quiet loudest still. And reach the branches that tree beside your bedroom window, growing to grasp you, though felled ago no less than half a decade. How a day so dear and treasured began with a fist in your face, skin to skin. Even the memory of that sound, somehow. I mean, I love so much about this poem. I often think about Horace's, the Roman poet Horace's pronouncement that a good poem should delight and instruct, dulce et utile. And I think about the ways in which poets are often quite quickly galloping towards instruction, right? We know that poems are supposed to mean and mean intensely, and we know that poems are supposed to say grand, important things. And I think that oftentimes the delight comes as a sort of afterthought, right? And when I say delight, you know, dolce, sweetness, I'm not saying like, you know, a baby's pink toes wagging or a puppy's happy tail, right? I'm talking about a surprising encounter with language. I'm talking about an interesting turn, you know, the placement, though fell to go no less than half a decade, right? It's a place as opposed to half a decade ago, right? I'm talking about surprise, right? And I'm also talking about the sort of there's an oracular quality to this poem that really, I mean, it's almost like kabbalistic, you know, the sort of like the way, you know, God governs only what happens while it happens. This want is wine of your own making. I mean, I don't know if you can see that. I don't know if you can see that, honorable Kenyon Review watchers, but I got goosebumps as I was saying that. God governs only what happens while it happens. This want is wine of your own making. You know, there is, you know, you could just sort of roll that line around your mouth like a pebble, right? And just, you know, every new suck you'll extract like a new way of thinking about God. I've been thinking a lot in my own practice, and I think that Chase and I are very, very simpatico in this way. And her poetry is always very, very instructive for me in this way, of the way that poetry can act as a kind of notational theology, right? As a way of sort of like the way that, like, you know, the systematic language of logical notation, right, can like denote different kinds of logical structures, how we can use sort of semantic language to denote theological structures, right? And I think that for me, Chase is one of the best poets that we have writing today, one of the young poets to whom I look and watch the most in terms of thinking about like interesting and fresh ways to approach this tradition of notational theology, which, you know, has preceded us by literal millennia, right? She's doing a lot to sort of carry it in new ways. And so you have this poem that ends in this image of real violence, right? And it begins, you know, in whist is wetness and why wind, why, you know, and this sort of like this language that just is almost onomatopoeic, right? Like it feels on the tongue the way that it means, right? And the movement between those things feels so like, you know, from the comfort to the awesome in the old sense of the word violence of the divine, right? It's just a masterful poem. And again, like, you know, you put the whole poem in your mouth and it changes you. And I think that so much of how this poem means and affects AFFECT us happens in the silences in between the semantic content of the poem, right? It's just masterful. It's just masterful. So I realized I didn't frame any of that as a question.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, Chase.
This particular poem came out, was like sort of the last remnant of an entire series of poems that all had the same title. But I think it was like a year and a half ago, I started becoming really obsessed with the idea of nostalgia, its Greek roots, like nostos and algos, homecoming and pain. And I was really interested in the closeness between those two things.
Mm-hmm.
The way that the feeling of nostalgia is one that we like often think of in this like lighter sense, but then like when people first came up with the idea, it was like describing this disease, and it feels like like I think nostalgia can be useful but dangerous.
Yeah.
Um, and I write a lot about things that scare me lately.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are. I think the poem is a good place to hold those things. Cool. Well, I love this poem. I love you. Do you want to do
Yes.
the other one?
Yeah. So I chose a poem of yours from your first book, which is one of those like bedside table books, which is one of those like, oh, I don't like want to read anything new. I just want to like sink into language books. Like one of those. I have a tendency to dog ear, so like one of those really beat up old books on my shelf, and this poem in particular like has a particular importance to me. It's called "Unburnable. The cold is flooding our lives." The prophets are alive but unrecognizable to us, as calligraphy to a mouse. For a time they dragged long oar strokes across the sky. Now they sit in graveyards, drinking coffee, forking soapy cottage cheese into their mouths. My hungry is different than their hungry. I envy their discipline, but not enough to do anything about it. I blame my culture. I blame everyone but myself. Intent arrives like a call to prayer and is as easy to dismiss. Rumi said, the two most important things in life were beauty and bewilderment. This is likely a mistranslation. After 30 years in America, my father now dreams in English, says he misses the dead relatives he used to be able to visit in sleep. How many times are you allowed to lose the same beloveds before you stop believing they're gone? Some migrant birds build their nests over rivers to push them into the water when they leave. This seems almost warm, a good harm. The addictions that were killing me fastest were the ones I loved best. Turning the chisel toward myself, I found my body was still the size of my body, still unarmored as wet bread. One way to live a life is to spend each moment asking forgiveness for the last. It seems to me the significance of remorse would deflate us with each performance. Better to sink a little into the earth and quietly watch life unfold, violent as a bull ring. The carpenter's house will always be the last to be built. Sometimes a mind is ready to leave the world before its body. Sometimes paradise happens too early and leaves us shuddering in its wake. I am glad I still exist. Glad for cats and moss and Turkish indigo, and yet to be light upon the earth, to be steel bent around an endless black, to once again be God's own tuning fork, and yet. So this poem of yours is one of those talismanic poems for me, a thing I return to again and again for comfort, security, and reminder. When I first encountered your book, I was still drinking, and it made me feel shaken and seen and deeply disturbed. I have this distinct memory of reading this poem on the train ride home from your book launch at the Ace Hotel in New York, where I'd been drinking whiskey out of a water bottle all night. And
I remember that.
Yeah. And I was on the train and I opened up this book And I opened to this poem, and I read this poem, and I like took that last little gulp of whiskey. The moment I got to the line, "My hungry is different than their hungry." And I remember feeling like so like it more than just annoyed, but like angry at you for a moment, like not wanting to be seen. It just like the confluence of all of these feelings, the shame of the evening, the like knowledge that, oh, once again I have done this same thing that I've been doing, and nobody else around me is doing this thing. I didn't want to end the harm that I was doing to myself, and then I felt a harm from reading this. But like you say, this is a good harm. Your poems and your living example of a writer who I saw there, like doing the thing without the other thing, which I didn't know was possible. That was part of that push for me, that I needed. I needed to fall toward the water. I needed out of that nest, and you and this book were there for me when I fell, helped me acclimate to a life above the waves. It's a little disconcerting to suddenly realize our prayers might actually be heard. That there is maybe something receiving them, that there is maybe something we receive in kind. It takes a bit of getting used to, or no, I'm not sure we ever get used to it. We're still shuddering in its wake. Life is bewildering, as Rumi says, mistranslated. This is a desperate poem, born of the kind of desperation God beneficently afflicts us with, a nest pushing. It is a prayer, like nearly all of the poems in this book, a thing sent into the ether, wanting to be heard. Paul Celan calls this a message in a bottle, and he asks, toward what? Toward something standing open, occupiable, perhaps an addressable thou, an addressable reality. This poem, you're asking someone or something to meet you, to help you wake the fuck up, to help you turn towards something other than the frenzied self-obsession.
The beneficent desperation is about the best thing that I've ever heard. That's about the best construction I've ever heard anyone make about my work. That's exactly it. You know, the gratitude I feel today for the desperation that felt so immobilizing then, because you know, no one ever goes to get help, you know, when everything's going really well. You know what I mean? Like you don't like win the lottery and you're like, okay, well, I guess it's time to fix my life now too. You know, I think that for most people it works in the opposite direction. I feel very lucky that the poem and the poems found you. You know, I think it's a great ambition of every poem that I write, that it might find someone for whom it can be practically useful in some small way, you know, in their living. And that they were able to sort of bring us together and, you know, play some infinitesimally small part in scaffolding your recovery, which, you know, was not an easy thing, you know, for you or for anyone to do. And now you have 2+ years of sobriety, which is pretty fucking cool.
Yeah, it's really cool.
I'm grateful for your sobriety. I'm grateful for your friendship. I'm grateful for your poems.
Thank you so much for tuning in to the final week of Kenyon Review's summer series, In a Few Words. Please consider supporting the Kenyon Review. You can make a donation by clicking the button at the bottom of the screen. Thanks again. See you soon. Good night.